Hi folks, I'm Richie of OC Photography. I just thought I'd put together this little video today to help you start moving away from the auto setting on your camera and learn to master the manual controls. This thing I've drawn here is the exposure triangle, and this is the most important thing you'll have to master on your camera if you want to learn how to properly expose your image. Now, you might be wondering why. You need three, yes, you've guessed, it's a triangle, three settings in order to expose your image. Why isn't there just a setting for brighter and darker? Well, these three settings don't only affect the exposure, they have other effects on your final image. Let's start with aperture. If you look inside the glass of your lens, you'll see a little iris. This works very much like the iris of your eye. In a dark room, your iris gets wider to let in more light. In a bright room, it gets smaller. This works exactly the same way. On auto settings, your camera decides how wide it should be to properly expose for the image. But in manual, you're going to have to control this yourself. The wider the aperture, you guessed it, more light. Smaller, less. Pretty simple, right? Now let's move on to the other setting. We'll call this, it is called shutter speed. Now the shutter speed is basically how long your camera takes to take the photo. And as you can imagine, the longer it takes to take the photograph, the more light is going to get into the sensor. So longer, brighter. Shorter, darker. Pretty simple too. Now let's move on to the last setting. This is the ISO. ISO is basically how sensitive your sensor is to light. Now you've guessed it. More sensitive, more light. Less sensitive, less light. Now these are the three things that on auto setting, your camera will automatically adjust and balance to properly expose your image. Now you might be wondering, why would I want to use these elements in manual mode? The reason is that these elements don't just affect the exposure of your image, as I said at the start, they have other effects. Now let's go back to aperture here. As we said earlier, wider, brighter, narrower, darker. This isn't the only effect this will have on your final image. Let's take an example here. Let's say you're taking a photo of a model and it has a very busy backdrop that distracts from the subject of your image. Here is where a wider aperture might be helpful. A wider aperture creates a shallower depth of field. This means that if you focus on your subject, things further into the background will be out of focus. You may have seen these kind of images on Instagram or magazines, street photography. We have a picture of your subject here, and the background is all blurred out. This is an excellent way to draw attention to your subject. However, let's take another example. Let's say you have a group shot, and you have a couple of people standing behind the person in front. Now this won't do if you have a shallow depth of field, because these people in the background will be out of focus. Here is when a narrower aperture might be called for. The narrower the aperture, the deeper the depth of field. This is great for group shots or landscape photography. Now, let's move on to shutter speed. Shutter speed, as we said earlier, is how long your shutter takes to snap the image. Longer, brighter, shorter, darker. The other effect shutter speed has on your image is motion blur. Take this for an example. We have someone running. If you have a longer shutter speed, there will be motion blur. Because obviously if the photo has been taken over a longer period, it is capturing an image of your subject from the point it starts taking the image to the end. So there will be blur between when the subject was at this point and arrives at their end point. A faster shutter speed will mean that your subject will be snapped over a shorter duration, which means there will be less motion blur. Typically, you will want motion blur if you want to create special effects, such as a blur in the water of a waterfall, or you want to capture the movement of someone sprinting or dancing. But if you're doing sports photography and you want to capture the players running around the pitch in sharp detail, you'll want a faster shutter speed. Now let's move on finally to ISO. ISO is how sensitive your camera is to light. As we said before, less sensitive, less light, more sensitive, more light. The other effect ISO has in your image is image grain. The more sensitive, or the higher your ISO, the more image grain will come into your image. The less sensitive, the less grain. Pretty simple. Now, let's look at all these images together. Let's take a scenario. Let's say you want a subject and a blurred out background. The problem is that if you open up the aperture more, then you're letting in more light, and you might overexpose your image. To compensate for this, you can have a faster shutter speed, or take the photo over a shorter duration of time to let in less light this way. And this will allow you to open up the aperture more so that you can get the nice blurry background. Alternatively, let's look at shutter speed. If you want to capture motion blur of a subject running, or a nice blur in the water of a waterfall, then there's going to be more light in your image. And this can lead to overexposure unless you balance it by adjusting some of the other settings. So if you want to get a blurry waterfall or motion blur in someone dancing or running, you might want to tighten up your aperture to let in less light in this setting. This is how you balance these different settings. But what about this scenario? What if you want to capture a subject that's moving in sharp focus with no motion blur, and you want the background in sharp focus? This will mean you will need a fast shutter speed and a small aperture. How are you going to properly expose your image without it becoming underexposed? Where's the light going to come from? Well, here is where ISO comes in. Generally, this is the last setting you're going to look at, as I said. you will want to try and balance shutter and aperture to achieve the desired exposure and result. But if you need to achieve an effect like this, you will have to raise your ISO. Ideally, you'll want to do it in increments and use as low an ISO as possible, but high enough that your image isn't underexposed. As we said earlier, the higher the ISO, the more grain and less detail you'll have in your image. So try and keep this as low as possible while still exposing properly for your image. Now let's take another scenario. What if you want motion blur and a shallow depth of field to get a nice blurry background? What does that mean? That means you will need a wide aperture and a slow shutter speed. So what are we going to have to do? We're going to have to lower ISO as low as possible in order to achieve the desired result. Now the blackboard has gotten a little messy here, so let's move along here to recap. Shutter speed is the duration of time it takes to snap your image, or the length of time the camera shutter is open, exposing light onto the camera sensor. Basically, it's how long your camera takes to take the photo. The slower the shutter speed, the more light gets into your camera. The faster the shutter speed, less light. Slower shutter speed leads to motion blur in your image. Fast shutter speed, less or no motion blur. ISO is how sensitive your camera is to light. The higher the ISO, the more sensitive it is to light. The lower the ISO, the less sensitive. Higher ISOs introduce grain into your image and lessen detail. Lower ISOs retain more detail and have less or no noise. The aperture is the mechanical iris on the lens of your camera. The wider the aperture, or the more open it is, the more light gets to the sensor of your camera. The narrower the aperture, or the more closed it is, the less light gets to the sensor. The wider the aperture also creates a shallower depth of field. The narrower the aperture creates a deeper depth of field. The settings of the exposure triangle will appear on your camera as follows. Shutter speed will appear as fractions of a second. The higher the fraction, the faster the shutter speed. The lower the fraction, the slower it is. ISO will appear as an ISO number under your settings. The higher this number is, the more sensitive your camera will be to light. The lower it is, less sensitive. The aperture of your lens will appear as an f number, or f-stop. The lower this number is, the wider your aperture will be. The higher it is, the narrower your aperture will be. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial from OC Photography. If you'd like more tutorials, please let us know in the comments.